Hi guys, it's Jess and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if it is your first time here. Today I'm going to be doing my wrap up for the month of May, and I had a pretty good reading month in May. I enjoyed a large number of the books that I read, so let's just jump straight in. The first book that I read and thoroughly enjoyed was Harry Potter number 6, which is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. There isn't much that I can say about this, being the 6th book in the Harry Potter series, but this is my first time rereading these books, and I'm just really enjoying discovering details about the books that I missed the first time around because I was so desperate to get to the end and find out what happened. So I'm really enjoying my reread, and hopefully next month I will pick up number 7 and complete the reread in total. The next book that I read was a review copy which I requested from NetGalley, and that was The Stars Are Fire by Anita Shreve. I requested this because I thought that the premise sounded really interesting. It's about the wildfires which swept along the coast of Maine in the 1940s, so it's based on a true story, but unfortunately I DNF'd this book. I thought that the writing style was very strange. It was short paragraphs and collections of thoughts randomly cobbled together, and I didn't feel that it flowed very well. We followed the story of one young wife and mother called Grace, and I just found myself completely disconnected from her as a character, and the story just held no interest for me whatsoever, so I DNF'd it and I gave it 1 star. It was my first Anita Shreve book, so I'm not ruling out that I will ever try her writing style again. That just wasn't for me. The next book that I read was Wintersong by S.J. Jones. Now, on the surface of it, I really enjoyed this book. I thought that the premise was really interesting, it being a loose retelling of the Labyrinth story, but if you delve a little bit deeper into this book, then it very quickly becomes rather problematic. So I was aware going into it that it was a retelling of Labyrinth, but I had seen a number of reviews which sort of suggested that that was very loose, and so I didn't have many expectations. I'm a huge fan of Labyrinth, but I went into this without high expectations, and I think that that was probably the best way to read it. I decided to just take the book at face value, and I think that that definitely enhanced the enjoyment factor that I felt for the book. I thought that for a debut novel, the writing was very descriptive and very beautiful, and in places it flowed very well, and overall, for a YA fantasy book, I really enjoyed this. I also appreciated that our protagonist Liesl doesn't fit with the typical YA female lead, and that she finishes the book as a much stronger character than she began the story, and that we see that transformation happening. We don't just get told that it's happening, we can actually follow her transformation throughout the story, and I thought that that was done particularly well. The main problem that I had was with the Goblin King. The front cover, the descriptions on the front cover and the blurb on the back suggests that the Goblin King is going to be a kind of dark and mysteriously sexy character, and that really just did not translate off the page for me. I'd kind of got in my head that he was going to be a bit like Leigh Bardugo's The Darkling in her Grisha trilogy, and he just instead felt very one-dimensional for me. And we were told that he was mysterious, and we were told that he had this kind of humanized past, but it just didn't catch my interest and hold me, and I found that I really didn't care very much about his backstory, which was possibly the biggest shame for me because I had expected to like the Goblin King a whole lot more than I actually did. I also understand that this was written firstly as an adult fantasy novel and then was changed to a YA, and a lot of the more graphic sections were pulled out, which I think once you know that, it suddenly becomes very obvious that all the places where the writing was quite jarring are probably the places where the more in-depth details were stripped back from the story, and I think that in some ways that contributed then to this strange relationship that Liesl and the Goblin King had, where it was almost, without spoiling it, it was almost on the verge of abusive, but I can't really explain why without spoiling it, but it didn't gel, it didn't mesh for me, it was disjointed and it felt wrong, and yeah, it just really felt off. But overall I thought that this was an interesting and okay young adult read. I believe that there is another book coming out, and I would be interested to read it and see where the story goes. I thought that for a debut novel, it was written very well. Obviously there are a few problems, and I think that if you are a huge Labyrinth fan, you need to go into this story knowing that it is not a direct lift of the Labyrinth story. Next up, I read Seas of Snow by Karenza Jennings. This book was sent to me for the purpose of this review by the author, and this is a psychological drama set in the 1950s in the northeast of England, and we follow the story of a young girl called Gracie who lives with her mother, and their lives are thrown into turmoil when her mother's brother Joe comes onto the scene. And Joe is a psychopath, and he begins a long drawn out torment of both Gracie and her mother. And Gracie finds relief from this horrendous circumstance that she finds herself in through a discovery of poetry, both reading and writing poetry, and with her charming friendship with their neighbour Billy. There are definite trigger warnings in this book for domestic abuse, for child abuse and for sexual abuse, and I think that it is important knowing that going in, because a lot of the abuse is quite graphically described and is quite in depth, particularly because we do get the point of view of Joe as he's carrying out some of the acts, and I think that it is quite important that you're aware of that going into this story. This is obviously a very dark story, but the thing that I really liked about it was that there are also a lot of uplifting moments. I thought that the prose was very beautifully written in places, and I think that the relationship between Gracie and Billy is just incredibly sweet and was one of the major things which kept me coming back to find out what happened at the end of this book. Pacing was a little bit of an issue. You flick between the past and the present, and you jump between various points of view, and I struggled sometimes to place the events that were being described on the overall timeline, and I also was very dissatisfied with the ending. I thought that it jarred greatly with the way that the rest of the story was written, and I felt like we were just handed the ending and then that was it, the book was finished. So I wish in some ways that the ending had been explained a little bit better, but overall I thought that for a psychological drama it was very interesting, it hooked me. I thought that the author did a very good job of describing Gracie's transitions through these terrible, horrendous circumstances, but the ways that she found the beauty and the life kind of in everyday moments. So yeah, I did enjoy it. I gave it a 3-star I think on Goodreads, but it could probably be a 3.5 star. I thought that it was a very solid read. Next, I read Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is a story set during the 1960s about the Biafran War. Basically, Biafra was striving for independence from Nigeria, and what followed was a whole series of horrendous circumstances and behaviours during the war. This is obviously a fictionalised version of those events, and we follow 5 characters in various stations of life. So we have a houseboy, we have a very privileged young woman, we have a white man from England who moves over to Nigeria, and all these different characters, and we follow their perspective and their experiences during the Biafran War. This story is not perfect, it's not without issues. There is a little bit of interesting descriptions of life, sort of there are lots of affairs and lots of very soap opera type events that take place, but I think that because it's based on true events, it's incredibly important, and I felt like my eyes were really opened to a time in history that I haven't come across before. And although it was horrendous reading about the way people's lives were during the war, I think that it is incredibly important to read, and I'm really glad that I read it. Then we have Wonder by R.J. Palacio, and I adored this book. This is a middle grade book about a young boy called August who has a facial disfigurement, and because of that he has been homeschooled, but at the start of this book when we meet August, he's about to start 5th grade in a mainstream school. Now this is a super quick read. I read it in one sitting, and it's just a wonderful book about friendship, about acceptance, family, forgiveness, and ultimately about being kind. I really enjoyed this book. I really enjoyed that we got different points of view throughout the story. I loved the whole overarching thread in the story. I just really loved it, and I believe that it's coming out as a movie, and I'm really excited to see it because I just thought that this was fantastic. And then I read The 100-Year-Old Man, Who Climbed Out of the Window and Disappeared by Jonas Jonasson. This is a fairly amusing read. It is literally what it says on the tin. You follow the story of a 100-year-old man who climbs out of the window of the old people's home that he is in on his 100th birthday, and you follow all kinds of hijinks that he gets up to from then, and you flick between his past and his present. So you go through his life when he was supposedly involved in all these major political events from like the 1930s up until the present day. It was amusing, it was entertaining, there was some definite laugh out loud moments alongside some more interesting political observations. I think it is what it is. It was fairly long-winded and waffly in places, and I do think it could have been shorter and more concise, but I enjoyed it for what it was. I think I gave it 3 or 4 stars. Yeah, and I wouldn't hesitate to pick up another of Jonas Jonasson's books in the future. So there you go, they are the books that I read in the month of May. Do let me know in the comments section down below any books that you read and particularly enjoyed this last month. Don't forget to give me the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more content, and I will see you all soon.